So, hi everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Luke Joas. I'm regional sales manager for Reflectiz across APAC. Really excited to be here with you today to talk through some of the key trends we're seeing in this fast-moving space from both a security and a compliance perspective. So, in today's session, we'll focus on those two worlds, if you like. So, the evolving compliance requirements and some of the real world challenges that teams are facing in meeting these and the learnings and examples we've gathered through our dealings with those customers. So we're joined today by Yuquan Cheng from PCI Council. Really pleased he's been able to be part of this conversation today. We work closely with Yuquan and love working with him. So I'll hand over just now really quickly, Yuquan, to introduce yourself and your role.
Sure. Thank you so much again, Luke. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you based in Australia. Greetings from sunny Singapore. It's a lovely day here in this side of the world. As Luke mentioned, my name is Yuquan, or if it's easier, YK works fine as well. And I'm the Regional VP for PCI Council, looking after various regions. Now, my role at PCI is engaging with stakeholders. So it could be solution providers like Reflectiz, and Luke is a key stakeholder for me, as well as any one of you. As long as you have to touch PCI standards in general, my job is to support you in order to then drive payment security, making use of our standards. So feel free to reach out. Don't be a stranger. I studied in Monash once upon a time. Love my time down under. So, feel free to reach out if there are any PCI related questions. Yeah, I do have a slide later on my contact information so that, you're welcome to then reach out directly or, get connected on LinkedIn. Yeah. So in the interest of time, thank you again for being on time. I will just pass the mic back to our dear host, Luke.
Thanks, Yuquan. Yeah, appreciate that. We'll be hearing from you very soon, no doubt, on some of the trends that we're seeing specifically around 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. So why don't we talk a little bit around that, how we're going to structure our time. So first, I'll start with setting the scene, looking at why web exposure matters, and how it's become one of the more challenging areas for both security and compliance teams to focus on. Then we'll hear again from Yuquan on his perspective from the PCI Council to walk us through those new controls and how they apply in practice, as well as some more recent updates that we're seeing there. We'll then go into some lessons from the field, both from what we've heard more generally from customers, but more specifically a couple of key use cases that we have and stories from Village Roadshow and one from Leeds United. There's a good contrast between these two, in one story being about proactive compliance and visibility, and the other where it was an incident that happened outside PCI scope, but still very much in line with what we're talking about from a client-side security, web skimming, Magecart factor. We'll jump into a quick Q&A. So please, as we're going through the session, post your questions. We've dedicated a nice time to that, kind of 2/3 through the middle of the session. I'll then wrap up with some next steps. Yuquan will talk in a bit more specifics around how you can engage with the PCI Council itself. I'll talk through some recommended actions from our side, and then if anyone wants to hang around for a bit longer to do some more Q&A, we'll be available till the top of the hour. So why don't we get into the overview, I guess, on Reflectiz and just a bit of a quick background on that. So we are what we call a web exposure company. So we completely agentless and focused on client-side visibility. So in simple terms, we help organizations understand what's actually happening inside the browser on the client side, basically what applications are there, what data they're collecting, and where that data is flowing, including third parties, fourth parties, and beyond. As you can see here, we work with a broad range of customers across Australia and globally, brands like Lion, Event, or EVT, Myer, Kmart, etc., eBay, Live Nation internationally. And the common thread across obviously these businesses is that they need to manage website or client-side exposure, what we say is a proactive approach without causing any friction in terms of the customer experience. A very quick one on me. I've spent the last decade or so leading go-to-market and regional expansion for security and tech companies like Pantera and Malwarebytes. But earlier in my career, I worked with advisory companies like Gartner and CEB Corporate Executive Board. So I really enjoy helping new technologies build their presence in this market and build strong communities of customers and partners. And certainly here in APAC, we're growing rapidly with the team here in Sydney, expanding out our technical resources, and really forging some of those relationships with enterprise customers and partners as they're managing this space of client-side security. So, of course, we'll jump into the PCI, which is a key use case for a number of these customers. But before we do that, as I said, I will jump into a little bit around what we're seeing from the problem space, right? So obviously the web environment, the website environment is constantly changing, and there's 4 pressure points that we're seeing here. So the first is around site complexity. So most organizations, certainly if you're transacting through your website, are running dozens of third-party scripts, probably more, sometimes hundreds or more than if you've got multiple different brands. And a lot of these aren't necessarily security approved to begin with, and they weren't procurement approved, but they're there for good reason, right? They give functionality to the website. We're not saying to lock down everything on the site so you'd have no attack surface. They're there for good business sense, right? But there's obviously increasing complexity there with the functionality that we're looking for online and through our websites. The second part is security stakeholder overlap, right? So there's a lot of different teams that are involved in managing the website, from security, obviously compliance has got an overlay, but marketing is looking to add things to drive conversion naturally. Engineering wants the site not to break. So there's a mix there in terms of who actually owns the browser. It'd be difficult to get on the same page there without shared visibility of what's happening there. The third point is increased compliance, which we'll obviously touch on shortly with Yuquan talking through the PCI specifically, but seeing a range, obviously, with data residency requirements. More locally, the OAIC came out with some privacy expectations and priorities leading into this year. And so really more and more, it's the browser layer is becoming increasingly a focus, if you like, for these regulatory bodies that we need to abide by. And fourth, of course, from a security perspective, the evolving threat landscape, right? So form jacking, skimming, Magecart, obviously all happening, but we're seeing a rise in these sorts of attacks. Attackers like complexity, right? So they like complex supply chains, shared responsibilities, and areas that are difficult to detect from traditional controls like the server side. So
Luke?
as you can see at the top, yep.
Oh, sorry. I thought, finish your point. I cannot resist
I'll just finish this point. I'll
jump
wrap it
in.
out with the CTEM part at the top here. So just in terms of framing from the more security perspective, I'm sure a lot of your security vendors are talking about this continuous threat exposure management, or CTEM. CTEM is obviously a useful framework, right, in terms of understanding what that broad visibility of your attack surface looks like, and context and prioritization. It's a language that everyone's using, but when we talk about the browser, so we're talking web exposure needs to be a part of that, right? Because the browser is effectively becoming that endpoint or that attack surface or exposure point where customers are dealing and handing over that data, right? So it's where they put the card data, their personal info, behavioral data. And traditionally, this is one of the least monitored attack surfaces across the broader ecosystem, right? So we believe, and what we're seeing is that you need to have a proactive approach with clear visibility that sits across this. So I'll hand it to Yuquan now, or in a second. When we were doing these slides, he said that he wasn't sure if the PCI part was an increase in complexity. I'll leave you guys to be the judge on if that's the case or not. But I'll hand over to him now to talk a bit more specifically about 6.4.3, and then we'll talk about some of the learnings that we've had.
Well, you're more than entitled to your comments, but if you can just switch back to the earlier slide, please, Luke.
Yeah.
Just so that it's on this point. Yeah. So I cannot resist myself, given that you have PCI grouped under the box of increased compliance complexity. And I should
Mm,
use this opportunity to just state that PCI Council as an organization, we are a standards setting body, right? We manage the 15 PCI standards, of which PCI DSS, data security standard, is arguably the most well-known of all of our 15 standards, right? And probably the reason why we are dialed into this webinar today. It is not the intention of PCI to make your lives miserable by increasing the complexity of your jobs. Yeah. And towards the later part of today's webinar, I will be sharing with you how PCI Council works closely with organizations like Reflectiz. Reflectiz, in case you're not aware, they are a PCI associate participating organization, like a member, if you will. Yeah. So I'll be sharing a little bit more on what that means and why some of the largest brands in the world are part of the PCI community to really then help to influence and improve global standards. Now, I don't know the background for those of you who are in the call today, but um, it is a lot of work. It is hard work to protect data assets within your respective organizations, right? But if there are ways to make your lives more pleasant and less complicated, and to get out of this box that Luke has lumped PCI under, I'm more than happy to engage with you and to hear if there are any thoughts on how we can improve the standards. But I'll pause for now to let Liu continue, and I'll share a bit more details towards the later part of the webinar. Liu, can I
thanks,
think
Shukran.
up next? I saw the next slide.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So we were going to talk a little bit around these sections for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1.
Yeah.
It'd be great to get your perspective on, I guess, the nature of what they were looking to achieve. There's obviously been some more recent updates to
I will
how that
cover that.
applies.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. So just to level set, and I didn't want like a full slide with lots and lots of tags, right? So what I am hoping to do with this slide is really just to level set and to give you a flavor of what we're talking about. And I'm sure all of you, just like Luke, you've memorized all of the PCI DSS requirements, inside and outside. But without going into too much detail, and I should probably highlight that all of the PCI standards are available to download free of charge, so that you can look at each of these requirements in as much detail as you like to, as well as some of the supplementary guides that we have also provided, which I'll cover in a short while. Okay. But essentially, requirement 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 are around page scripts that are residing on your payment pages, right? So this could be JavaScript or whatever code that we are loading onto a consumer browser. Okay, and these requirements are really to then ensure that the scripts that are operating there are managed securely. Now, since PCI DSS version 4.0 was first published in March of 2022, so quite a few years now, uh, there have been feedback that payment web pages are evolving. There's a lot more. It's a lot more dynamic, and there's a lot more objects, right, that are assembled from various stakeholders, various various locations, and how web pages used to be managed as far as the content is concerned. It was a little tricky to then deploy change detection mechanism. And ultimately, that's where the requirements were first drafted and published in March a few years ago, to then have these two requirements that would enable stakeholders to detect changes, as well as to identify if there are malicious activities happening on the consumer browser page as that page is being constructed. And, in this case, the JavaScript being interpreted. Yeah. And I did pick up that, Luke mentioned, the types of scripts that can be running on the web page. He mentioned marketing, it could be advertising, it could be a chatbot, for example, all sorts of tracking scripts, to stay on top of, what is your experience like. And that's why, presumably that was the one of the box in the earlier slide on why, it can then be a source of contention on who gets to say what runs on the script, on the web page. Okay. Now, for requirement 6.4.3 specifically, and again, the detailed description of the requirement is available within the PCI DSS document. It is version 4.0.1 right now, and it was published middle of last year, if I remember correctly. Okay. Now, 6.4.3, no changes to the requirement itself. It is to make sure that each script on the payment page must be authorized. You must know what is going on, right? And in this case, hopefully that helps to provide some sort of pressure for all of the different teams to work together so that, exactly which script should be running on the payment page. Somebody knows what it is and it is authorized. Right. I've read a blog a while ago that in some cases there are lots and lots of scripts running, and in a lot of cases, some scripts, nobody has any idea what that script is doing and who owns it. 6.4.3 also covers that the integrity of the script needs to be managed, and there needs to be an inventory of all of the scripts that are operating on the payment web pages. Now, as far as applicability, and when you look at the actual PCI DSS document itself, the requirements itself is actually fairly short. The guidance and the requests that PCI has been getting over the years is stakeholders want to know what exactly is this requirement for, what are we hoping to achieve, and what does it apply to? Okay, so there is also an applicability section, and this requirement applies to all scripts loaded both from the entity's environment as well as scripts loaded by the entity's third parties or even fourth parties or beyond onto the web page. All right. You will also, for those of you who have seen the standards before, you will notice that this used to be a best practice, but from 1st of April of this year, this requirement, as well as all of the other optional requirements, are now mandatory. So it is not a deadline. It will still follow your compliance window. So if you were, say, compliant from 1st of January, based on your compliance window, you will likely have to review this on 1st of January 2026, and you will then have to consider this requirement being mandatory. Again, I must stress, PCI is a standard setting organization. We do not manage the compliance nor enforcement of our own standards. This requirement is, you have to comply with this requirement because of your contractual obligation with your acquirer or your merchant bank, if you're a merchant, or a payment brand, if you're the acquirer yourself. Okay. So just quickly moving on, requirement 11.6.1, it is around the change and tamper resistant mechanism, and that, the relevant personnel must be alerted to unauthorized modification. And there's reference to, the relevant or security related HTTP headers as well as the script content, right? There's also reference around how often you should do this, whether it is, at least once a week or periodically based on a new acronym that was introduced in version 4.0 called TRA, or Targeted Risk Assessment. And this replaced the earlier way of performing risk assessments before version 4. So this requirement, you can do a specific risk assessment to then assess and document why, perhaps you are then doing this monitoring of your payment scripts over a different time interval. Okay. Now, there is a useful part which I've been guided by the PCI standards team in headquarters, and that is covered under what is called the customized approach. Now, I didn't memorize any of these requirements as too many things to do at PCI, but the customized approach is essentially a way for organizations that may be a little bit more innovative, and they are of the opinion that the existing requirements that is outlined is, too prescriptive and it doesn't really apply to me. All right, so it's a slightly more flexible way of meeting your PCI DSS obligation, where you can define your own requirements. Of course, it doesn't mean that you are able to dilute the requirements because this will then be challenged by your security assessor. Okay, now for the customized approach, it is a good way to figure out exactly what is the objective that PCI is trying to achieve. And in this case, for this requirement, it says, and I'll quickly summarize that for e-commerce skimming code and techniques, that this cannot be added to the payment pages as received by the consumer browser without a timely alert being generated. Okay, and there's also additional references that for measures around anti-skimming, for example, you cannot then remove this without an alert being generated in a timely manner. Okay, so the customized approach gives you a more objective way of meeting your PCI DSS obligation. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions around this, but this is a good guide as guided by the standards team in PCI headquarters on trying to figure out what exactly this requirement is trying to achieve. Now, just with 2 more minutes that I have allocated for this slide, I just want to quickly cover off what Luke mentioned about the changes. And, I've received some feedback that some of these changes may be a little bit confusing given the time frame at which we have published some of our updates. Now, to be clear, requirements 6.4.3 and 11.6.1, nothing has changed with that requirement. It still is part of PCI DSS. The only changes that we have made is on the self-assessment questionnaire, or SAQ, and specifically for SAQ 8. This is typically adopted by the smaller merchants. Again, PCI doesn't dictate who has to do an on-site assessment where you have to do a report on compliance and which entities get to do a self-assessment questionnaire. This is defined by the payment brands. So the 6 payment brands that form the PCI Exco includes American Express, Discover, JCB, MasterCard, UnionPay, as well as Visa. So you should go to their respective web pages on PCI compliance to figure out, which merchants are supposed to do a full on-site audit when you complete a ROC, or report on compliance, or an SAQA. Yeah. So again, 6.4.3, 11.6.1 is generally applicable for the large majority of stakeholders. However, if you are permitted to do an SAQA, we have received many feedback from the industry and our stakeholders that for the smaller merchants, they need a little bit more flexibility. Some of them have no idea what these requirements are about, neither are they able to put in place controls to then address what we need to be done to protect the payment pages. Okay, now SAQA generally is adopted by the smaller merchants. Yeah, everyone else, all of the other SAQs, you still have to adopt 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. And the only changes that we have made for SAQA specifically for these two requirements is we have allowed the merchant to decide. Either you can choose to adopt the two requirements as it is, or you are allowed to engage with your stakeholders, and this could be your payment gateway, this could be potentially an acquirer, or any of the service providers, where you are then able to confirm that your payment pages are not susceptible to attacks, right? Where in essence, you have another party meeting the requirement to 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 on your behalf. You will see a reference in the PCI documentation to requirement 12.3.1, where that is also made an optional requirement for SAQA entities, because requirement 12.3.1 is around the requirement for targeted risk assessment, which, as I mentioned, for 11.6.1, there is a reference that you can use a TRA to define the intervals. Okay, now I'm not sure how clear that is in the short time I've been given for this, but lots of materials on the PCI website. Go to the PCI blog, which is under resources on our web page. Use the right-hand side category to identify PCI DSS version 4, and it should pop up straight away on all the PCI DSS related publication that we have made for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1. There's a FAQ that we have published. There's an information supplement that we have published. And I strongly encourage you getting the information supplement. It does cover the requirements as well as the payment page script related attacks in a lot more detail. Some of the suggestions on what you can do about it. And while not an endorsement for any organization, since PCI has to be neutral, naturally, I'm sure we will be hearing a lot of what you can do to protect our payment pages from Reflectiz. So I will keep it at there, given the few minutes given to me. Feel free to reach out in case there are questions. We do have a Q&A session later. Passing the mic back to you, Luke.
Thanks, Yuquan. Yeah, very, very good to get your perspective on the ethos and how it's all rolling out. There's some interesting things that we'll touch on now in terms of, as you're mentioning, where that accountability can lie with your payment gateway or acquirer and where that's sitting. But first, we'll talk a little bit around what we've seen when we're developing the solution, what came into mind, and then we'll go through some of those specific use cases. So when we started building and talking to customers specifically around the requirements, it began more with their concerns rather than features, right? So the first concern was around disruption, and their biggest fear was, if we're trying to fix compliance, is there anything that we're going to break in the process of doing that, right? Because these are obviously very sensitive things that we're touching on checkouts on production pages, which is tied to revenue, right? So we couldn't be any risk of that stopping or having a performance impact on that for any period of time. The other was, that they didn't want to be left alone, given that they're new requirements. So, we don't really have the time and resources to navigate the audits, without some perspective. So they wanted a partner that they could help guide them, through the audit, not just provide, some software and disappear. The other one was, some pressure to move fast. Now, I know that you said that it wasn't a hard deadline from the requirements perspective in April, but, if there is an audit on the horizon, we increasingly see that, people want something that they can stand up quickly in sort of days, not months. And some cases we've had people coming to us during audit times, right? Like depending on when that sits. So speed was another one. And of course, one of the other things is the operational overhead, right? So when they first came out, a lot of the concern was, you know, how many scripts have we got on our page, and validating all those at a, you know, in a weekly manner, it's just not going to be scalable for us, right? So we need some automation that enables us to reach the compliance burden, obviously with the ethos of what we're trying to achieve, with the requirements for 6.4.3 and 11.6.1 in terms of preventing against these sorts of attacks. But we've already got a stretched resource. So how do we manage that through automation, right? So there's some of the guiding principles that we had. So what I'll do next is I'll pivot to a case study we've got from Village Roadshow. Most of you would be familiar, a major entertainment company. They've got some diverse businesses, including cinemas and theme parks. I was hoping Kia could join us today, the CISO, but unfortunately had a better offer. He's on leave. So I'll share some of the highlights, and then I've got a short video that I'll share as well. So when the new standard came in, the team, you know, suddenly had this requirement they need to monitor every single client-side script on their website, right? And there were hundreds of them. So many of those scripts weren't even directly controlled by their internal teams because they've got, you know, deep relationships with third parties. So, you know, the big concern was, how do we do this without breaking our site or slowing everything down? So in addition to that, they also, in terms of the resourcing part we spoke about before, they have got a lean security team with limited bandwidth amongst other projects. And their compliance deadline was fast approaching, right? So classic example of them needing to move fast without adding some complexity. One thing I'll say is, you know, for those on the call, is when you think about your own environment, you know, how are you thinking about striking that balance between, you know, maximizing the business value and stakeholder flexibility without, you know, becoming a bottleneck for innovation, while you're trying to manage compliance, right? Something that we often hear coming up. So we'll jump into the solution now. So we deployed remotely, no code changes, no production impact, and within 24 hours in this instance, we had a fast onboarding. They were able to have full visibility into over 700 scripts that were running on their websites and digital assets. And then we set up some continuous monitoring, right, for smart approvals, so that what used to take, you know, would take hours in terms of manual validation was now automated with what we've got as called our smart approvals. And really importantly, it didn't disrupt any of their existing operations, right? So no infrastructure, no agents, no performance trade-offs. It was just working quietly in the background with no impact. So obviously important part, and while we're here today talking about compliance and on audit, etc. So, you know, when they reached the compliance, there was 0 observations, that, you know, no spreadsheets flying around or last minute panic. They felt really in control of something, you know, that had previously been really challenging for them and almost invisible in terms of what was happening on that page, right? So, you know, talking to Geo, is saying that they've, you know, in addition to passing the audit, they've changed how they're managing this area of compliance from moving to reactive to proactive, and still without having slowed down that innovation. So I'm going to show you a really quick video now. We've got a more detailed case study that we can share as well in follow-up, but I'll just jump.
If you want visibility into what your pages are doing and what your marketing team is doing in terms of, for example, adding tags here, there, wherever, and if all you're doing is taking a tag and adding it to your website, you might be losing a lot of visibility into what is actually happening in the background. This now gives us that ability to actually see what is happening. So if somebody came to me and said, add this tag to the website, we'd approve it from a security perspective, but now we can actually see what that tag does and then react to it as required. So yeah, from a visibility perspective, amazing. And what I like about the whole thing is that we haven't had to change anything on our websites. Right, we did not have to deploy any code, not create any accounts. All we had to do is give you guys links, and then the rest just happens from there. So that is also the best part. Yeah, that's the magical part. Yeah. So yeah, that was the easiest way, right? Because otherwise, if you had to go and make changes to your website, then you're already changing your website to detect changes, and then there's a whole rigmarole that comes out of that. So this was a lot easier.
So that's obviously a good example of when it can be done right. So they got ahead of the curve. They had the PCI requirements right, but there is a thing here that, we're obviously balancing between, obviously it's very important to meet this, and there's a need here for what scripts are running on the checkout. And that standard sets a baseline, right, for attacks. And this focuses very heavily on your checkout page security itself, right, which is obviously essential. There's no doubt about that. But attackers, they don't limit themselves to just your checkout page, and they'll target the broader customer journey as well. So login pages, search widgets, marketing pixels, as you quite mentioned before, any sort of chatbots there that are operating on your page, right? So many organizations assume that that PCI compliant, that they're secure. But in reality, there's a gap there, right? And one that attackers know how to exploit. So what we're seeing with one of these in particular is that outsourced payment providers, right? So sometimes, depending on that setup, there's the ability to not bypass, but maybe opt out of certain requirements that come with the PCI requirements, right? So even though you might be compliant on paper, in practice, you can still be exposed to a lot of those third-party connections. And in recent years, or recently, we've seen a number of client-side attacks through compromised third-party scripts. And they obviously like this vector, right? Because it's outside your firewall, it's typically invisible to your SOC, and not often monitored, right? In a way that typically we monitor other areas of our attack surface from a security perspective. So one of the things we're seeing is that, organizations are starting to realize that you can't just stop PCI, right, of a checkbox of approving scripts. You need to be doing a continuous approach of monitoring in a proactive way, so that the ability is that, you've got an understanding of what's happening on every page and across the broader customer journey, right? So that's another thing that we've been talking to. So what I'll do now is let's talk about another. Oh, yeah,
Luke, if I can, on your earlier slide, please.
sure.
So just to share a bit, for those of you who have joined the webinar today, is some feedback that or questions I've heard from stakeholders as I engage with them all around the world. And there's this misconception by some merchants, right? So where the merchants is of the opinion that, I don't really store any payment data, and I've outsourced everything. So in this case, PCI DSS doesn't apply to me at all, right? And because of that misconception, it has then led to an increase in the number of data loss or data breach incidents, where these merchants are then of the view that, if I don't need to comply with PCI DSS, whatever controls that I'm implementing on my web pages should be good enough. Yeah. So we're finding that these merchants would then end up with malicious software that's residing on their payment pages. So nothing is compromised with the sub pages, could be loaded through iframes, for example. So there's nothing wrong with the payment gateway. There's nothing wrong with the payment service provider, but it's on the hosting page that has been compromised. So this could be yet another script residing on the page that is then listening to the transactions as it's happening and then siphoning that off, right? So you literally do not even need to click submit. You could be typing your 6 or 17-digit credit or debit card number, and that number is then still siphoned off without even you clicking submit. Okay, now SAQA, as I mentioned earlier, it is applicable for those entities that have completely outsourced their PCI DSS, where they have outsourced everything to a third party. They could still retain payment reports or receipts, but in general, they are either an e-com merchant or a moto merchant in the card not present channel. Okay, so do check it out in case you are currently completing a SAQA, and whether that's applicable to you or not. Okay, back to you, Luke.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think that's a good segue, as I said, into this next one. I'm going to talk around, which we've got a more detailed again case study. Isaac, our VP, did a webinar program on this specifically. I'll go through sort of the high level, right? So this is exactly like as we were saying. So they came to Reflectiz after something gone wrong in this instance. So one of their third party services had been compromised with a malicious JavaScript skimmer, so which was injected into their checkout page, and it silently stole payment data and was there for 6 days before anyone noticed. Right, so in those 6 days, the attackers had access to sensitive customer information, clean payment, credit card data. But it wasn't a system failure, right? It wasn't because they didn't care about security. It's because it happened in a blind spot, right, on this client side where their existing tools didn't have visibility to it, right? So another point to pause on, and I think you just emphasized it there, you find that you know how much visibility you really have into the third party scripts that are running on your websites right now, and what they're doing, right? Not just visibility that they're there, but what are they doing? I'll jump into the next slide. I've just lost my mouse for a second. There we go. So the solution, right? So obviously, once they discovered the breach, the priority was pretty clear in terms of containing it fast and making sure it didn't happen again. So we were brought in, Reflectiz was brought in to give them that immediate visibility into every third-party component that was running on their website. And our platform was quickly able to identify malicious script and provide real-time alerts to their team. So, what could have been, weeks of forensic work turned into a swift and controlled response. And, because he acted so quickly, or they acted so quickly, they were able to contain that breach, remove that malicious code, and minimize any further damage. But what's important is that they didn't just clean up the mess of that script. They've changed the way that they're managing their security posture now. So with us in place, they're able to gain continuous visibility of that third party ecosystem and ensure that something like this won't happen again. So I've got another short video I'll play now. As I mentioned, there's a detailed webinar that goes through this specific breach and the process in place that I encourage you to have a look through and follow on. But let's have a quick look at this now.
And then what we did was we centralized a lot of the reporting, because at one stage, I'll use this analogy, you couldn't see the woods for the trees, in the form of there's so much information coming back that it's very easy to miss something, where now we've consolidated a lot of that. We've done a gap analysis. We've pulled in all of our systems into a centralized SOC, which has made it a lot simpler to be able to quickly get visibility.
Yes, as I said, I'd encourage you to have a look through, but that's an exact sample, right, of that third party running on the checkout, skimming that data, even though they thought they'd outsourced a lot of that risk. So we've got a couple of questions. We're running a little bit behind. I've got one or two here that we might touch on, and then we'll wrap up next steps and leave some time to the end. So one of them is around what have I got here? Yeah, how do most organizations struggle with these controls today? Do you want to take that one, Yuquan, or to start with? So basically, it's asking how organizations are struggling to meet these requirements and controls in terms of what we're hearing in the market.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, it is not our intention to make you struggle. So, but have a look at the requirement. There is a lot of information provided within the PCI DSS document already, right? So by way of guidance, description of what we're trying to achieve, and so on. And again, if you are struggling with this, then my best suggestion is to consult with a security assessor that you trust to get a view on how you can better address and implement controls specific to these two requirements. And I'm sure Luke is going to share with us what your thoughts on how you can come and bring world peace as well.
Yeah, of course. I think there's two things, right? The first part is like the visibility part. So anytime we see that someone's relying on manual lists and screenshots and without automation, obviously that's challenging, right? So we've seen multiple instances of potentially organizations going down that path and then realizing how hard it is even to get a first single view, let alone manage that
Yeah,
ongoing. So
yeah,
visibility is a big one, right? And then also the context that comes with that visibility. So it's not just a matter of knowing what's there, but what's it doing. And then the other one would be a process thing, right? So separate to what we're saying from like a
mm,
tooling perspective of
yeah,
understanding who owns what and having that shared visibility across those different teams, as we alluded to at the start,
yeah.
is can be an issue of friction as well. I've got one more question or
Oh,
another question that, oh yeah,
just on the
please.
earlier one, Luke. I think that was why PCI made the changes to SAQA, given
Mm,
that this um, self-assessment questionnaire is typically adopted by the smaller merchants who may not have
yeah,
same amount of resources as the larger organizations and larger merchants have, right? So, again, if there are feedback about specific requirements, if you are struggling with not only these requirements but other requirements, do feel free to reach out, especially if you have a view on how these requirements can be improved, right? So there are hundreds of companies around the world that are part of the PCI community. I'll touch on this in the next few slides, but you know, don't struggle in silence. I'm here to support you. Feel free to reach out if there are specific areas that you're struggling with. Yeah, it's certainly not our intention to have unnecessary complexity to the requirements.
yeah. Yeah, thanks, Shaquan. I think one of the things we see when organizations are operationalizing it well, is that it does become part of a broader strategy, right? So
Mm,
instead of just treating it as a PCI standalone compliance project, they're, showing how it implements into, existing controls, daily monitoring, but what we're saying
of
with
course.
Graham, right, having that
Yeah,
visibility. So,
yeah.
part of it is, meeting the PCI compliance, but
Mm,
the more that
mhm.
it's integrated into a broader strategy of
Right,
appreciating
right.
that this is part of the
Yeah,
attack ecosystem
understand.
now.
Of course, of
It
course.
brings visibility to it, and how do we operationalize it,
Yeah,
is key. So when we see customers doing it well, they're relying on a lot of that automation, right, and process, and having clear views on who's accountable to what, but treating it as part of their ongoing,
yeah,
security
yeah,
operations, if you like, daily functioning.
yeah. Ultimately, PCI's scope is focused on payments. That's where our remit is. That's where our expertise is. But I've spoken to so many companies who do adopt the standards beyond this, right? Because as you
Mm,
mentioned, there are other payment pages that do handle PII, for example, and those, so for example, say customer registration, right? There are
mm.
also other sensitive data that is just important as protecting financial related data. So those payment pages obviously shouldn't be neglected. So as you're looking at other aspects of your infrastructure, you're more than welcome to make reference to PCI standards. Really nothing to stop you from then adopting it. Okay?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think as we said before, there's some of the other areas around privacy, coming out as well, the way I see locally in Australia, kind of signifying, some of their priorities around engagement on websites, cookies and pixel tracking and the like. So I think it's, yeah, as you say, there's multiple um, assets to this when we talk about the client side, but obviously
Mm,
payments is a key factor. So a couple of
yeah.
other questions we'll look to get back to people. There's a few technical ones that we might be able to circle back to people on individually. What we might do now is talk through some of the next steps.
Mm,
So I might hand to you quickly on. I mean, you've
yeah.
talked about it at a high level, Yuquan, but maybe quickly touch on, how people can engage, and then I'll summarize some next steps and actions, from the Reflectiz side.
Yeah. So if you just bear with me for a few more minutes, I just want to share very quickly what I've been mentioning throughout the webinar, that since PCI Council was first formed back in 2006, uh, participating organizations, or PO for short, has always been an integral part of the broader PCI community, right? So with the recognition that PCI doesn't know everything all around the world, we rely on POs to provide feedback to us. Yeah. Since since September of 2022, we created a new framework for POs where there's now 3 levels. And I'll just quickly mention this. Now, for the individual participant, this is really structured towards the individual consultants out there, your academic professors, for example, who historically haven't been able to get access to PCI Council at all. They are now able to sign up as an individual participant to then get access to PCI resources. Now, for most of you, the associate participating organization and the principal participating organization will be more relevant. And the difference between the two is your associate participating organization provides you with the ability to really get involved more broadly in the standards, where we make changes to the standards both at the major and minor version level. You have the opportunity to provide feedback to the council directly before the standards become finalized. There are a lot of other benefits. For example, there are free and discounted trainings. There are opportunities to earn CPEs that you may need to maintain specific certifications, and so on. And the difference with the higher level principal PO is that the principal PO gets involved with the council a lot more actively and a lot more strategically, which means that they're not only talking to PCI about the next minor version changes of PCI DSS, we're talking to them about how does the future of PCI DSS look like. So this could be what may appear in version 5, version 6, and so on. Okay, if you quickly switch to the next slide, please, Luke. Okay, now we just concluded our Europe community meeting, a huge event with lots of stakeholders coming together to hear directly from the PCI leaders and the experts on some of the changes that PCI is thinking about, right? So there's still time. Next week, I'll be heading over to Bangkok together with Luke, who will be there. So do consider joining us at the Bangkok conference. There's still time to sign up. PCI is going through changes, right? And some of the changes, from my vantage point, they are going to be some of the biggest changes ever. Okay, so you will hear some glimpse of what are some of the things that we are thinking about, with lots of opportunities to provide and engage with not only the PCI leaders and the experts, but also the payment brands that own PCI Council, right? So this includes the 6 global networks that I mentioned. And of course, it's always good fun to get together to chat about the standards, but also the payments and cybersecurity industry in general. So information is on the PCI website. From the main menu under events, you should see community meetings. Next year, we are going to have it in the similar format, where September, it will be North America, October in Europe, and November somewhere exotic in Asia Pacific. Okay. I have one more slide, Luke.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's my email address in case you need to reach out to me. And I know Luke has some more slides after this. Look me up on LinkedIn. I am active there as well, and I do post regularly. And I love to stay in contact with all of you. Yeah. Luke, passing the mic back to you to finish us
Yeah,
off.
I'll look to wrap up because we're on time. But I guess just talking through some of the key takeaways here. So, what is it really all telling us? I think firstly, visibility is everything, right? So you can't protect what you can't see. And the browser is now one of the most data-rich and least monitored parts of your environment. So it's really where customers are experiencing your brand. So visibility here is obviously critical for compliance, but also for trust and all the other things that we mentioned earlier. The second is that, manual processes, are hitting their limit, right? So we've all seen teams scrambling with spreadsheets, etc., for audits. but with web assets changing daily, it just doesn't scale, right? So automation and continuous validation are critical, and they're becoming, the new baseline. The third point I'd say is, we can't have controls getting in the way of the business. So the real success stories that we're seeing are the ones that, security strengthens resilience, but without slowing down business process and innovation. And finally, it's a shared group. As I said before, it's a shared ground. So it touches security, compliance, marketing, engineering, and the companies that are doing it best are the ones treating it as a shared responsibility, not just a handoff. So there again, some of the key lessons we've learned. We'll share some supplementary on the specific deep dives into the use cases. But in addition, if you like, for what to do next, there's a few simple ways from our side. First, you could, if you want a clearer picture of your environment, we can run a complimentary visibility scan. So it's quick, remote. It'll give you a tangible view of what's actually happening in that browser layer without any code changes or performance impact. Secondly, we've built a really strong PCI and client-side community now across Australia and New Zealand. We've got over 25 enterprise customers that we're working through with that have either already gone through or preparing for their next round of PCI compliance audit. So if you want to connect with some peers and hear what's working for them, let me know, and we can look to set you up an introduction. Third B, if you want a more detailed session, obviously we've kept it sort of high level today, but if you want to talk more specifically around the technology or, more in depth on how you can meet the requirements, let us know. Be happy to set that up. And of course, as you kind of mentioned, if you're heading to Bangkok, it's obviously short notice for us, anyone that's based in Australia, but I'm certainly looking forward to it, and I encourage you to keep across what's happening on the PCI Council. That's it from me. As I said, we'll make sure that we send through a follow-up with, a recording, some supplementary resources, links to connect with the PCI Council and beyond. Thanks so much for your time. It's been really great session. Thank you to Yuquan again for taking the time to walk us through and give his perspective. We'll look forward to talking to you all soon. Have a nice day. Bye for now.